Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Spider-Man 3 from 2007. So, since there is a newer Spider-Man 3 coming out, I thought I would review the older Spider-Man 3, as it is also the only Spider-Man film I have not reviewed ever. Never reviewed this for some reason. Reviewed both the other Sam Raimi's, the other Mark Webb, Andrew Garfield's, the other MCU ones. I haven't gotten to see a review No Way Home yet, but I will. But yeah, so I thought I should. This has always been sort of this messy, horrible movie that sometimes I feel like if I rethought it or figured, I've theorized probably more about how I could fix this movie, and there's a good movie in there somewhere, and like if you recut it, and there's some good elements, and I felt that for years, and then I rewatched it again because I got it on discount DVD or something, and I couldn't get through it because this movie is awful and there's no way to fix it at all. It's just a mess. Now, I think you could make the plot of this film 3 different movies, but as one movie, it is a jumbled mess of fuckery that I'm not sure if Sam Raimi dropped the ball. I'm not sure if the studio did. I don't even understand who messed up on what, because it just is a complete, the dip in quality from the second Spider-Man movie in 2004, which was, I think, in most people's eyes, the best live-action Spider-Man film. Or, I haven't seen No Way Home yet, but still, to go from the high that was that to this was really jarring. It's like going from Tim Burton's Batman to Joel Schumacher's Batman or something. It's really like going from Batman to Batman and Robin, because you have too many villains all of a sudden. You have several different plot lines. You have multiple love triangles. Wow, there's too much going on. I do think there's some promise in this. There's some interesting stuff Sam Raimi actually does. There's some things that still get quoted and are a part of pop culture today. Whether that's part of, I guess, the power of Spider-Man and the popularity of the Sam Raimi films, or just that we're all dumb, I'm not sure. Or we're dumb stupid about Spider-Man. Probably a combo of the two. But I do think there are some enduring moments. I do think there are some good parts in this. But it is really horrible. And I sort of get the nostalgia for it, frankly, because this came out kind of a big weekend for me, actually. It came out in 2007, which I think my grandfather had died a few days before this had come out. I actually got to go home to Baltimore and see this with my dad at the Senator Theater. My dad and my girlfriend is now my wife, and I think my friend Russ, I believe, I'm not sure about that one, but we all got to see it. It was not good, but it was at the Senator, which is an amazing theater. If you're ever in Baltimore, I recommend it. But it was kind of a big weekend, obviously, because my grandfather died, and there's the funeral stuff afterwards, and it was nice for my dad to have something to do because it was his dad before that we could do together and see another Spider-Man movie. I immediately thought it sucked. I always remember that with this film. And in addition, that this was 2007, I remember putting up, knock for stickers right after seeing this. And I even remember, obviously, this would be referenced in, I believe it's Marriage Magazine and the foreign movie, the early knock for stuff. Because things with Spider-Man 3, nobody liked this movie when it came out. There was nobody who was no, but let's be real. Even though it is the highest grossing Spider-Man movie, immediately people were like, what the fuck was that? And trying to analyze it. And I think everyone sort of gave up, but there weren't as many comic book movies. There were starting to be more, but there weren't as many. So it was still for comic book and nerd fans were this is our movie. This sucks. Almost immediately. Good thing 2008 with Iron Man and Dark Knight and that stuff, and a whole different era was next year with this. I mean, we had X-Men: The Last Stand in 2006, this in 2007. It didn't feel really that great at the time, but thankfully 2008 happened. I'm not going to summarize the plot because I think you could make a whole video on explaining that, and I would like you to explain to me, because I'm sure there's some stuff I'm oh really? Wow. That happened in this? That's interesting. This is sort of both a Black Suit Spider-Man story, a story of Sandman, a story of Eddie Brock becoming Venom, the conclusion of the Sam Raimi films, Gwen Stacy's there, and I think that's all of it. Oh, and we find out Sandman actually killed Uncle Ben, not Joe Cool or whatever. All of those plot lines make the mess that is this film. I think really it would be 3 films in my mind, which I think Sandman makes the most sense, because essentially these are Steve Ditko, Stan Lee Spider-Man movies, or at least let's say the first 100 issues of Spider-Man, which I know Ditko would not like these movies, and I don't think he saw them, but I mean, maybe he was in Times Square, he could have, but that's for anyway. But it was like the first issues. Aesthetically, it reminds me of that. So Sandman, if you look at Thomas Hayden Church's performance and his look, it feels very at home with that. And I think the idea of having a bad guy who is basically doing crime for good for his family, for his daughter who's sick, that's a positive thing in my mind. Whereas Spider-Man, who has the black suit on, he's a good guy doing things under a bad motivation, basically. And I think those two could have actually worked together. Everyone acts like get rid of Sandman. Sandman makes the most sense, really. To me, like, that would have been an interesting movie. If you're going to do a black suit film, that should be its own thing. Then you do Venom as its own movie. And the James Franco Green Goblin thing, it probably should have just been a Green Goblin movie. It would have made the most sense. When you get into the heirs of Green Goblin, it's not really something that interests me too much. I've noticed when you have like the younger Green Goblins in these movies, the looks aren't honestly that interesting and look like a really badly designed villain in a big movie that they don't like to show you in the ads because they know it's bad. It's like, I get that we had to have a culmination to that, but it almost feels like, you know, the idea of the culmination of that was probably better than actually doing it. I'd also like, how come nobody ever talks about it? Like, I'd like to see Doc Connors in these become the Lizard. Like, that's always been the thing I wanted. I really don't really care about the hairy Spider-Man thing. It's like, you could have waited a few movies. I would have been fine with that until you gave him like a cool, actually like a newer Green Goblin look to him. Actually, it's like kind of a piss poor design. That's sort of like the thing with these films, is like Sandman, it feels like Raimi cared about. The rest is like what Sony wanted to do or whatever. I know Sony really wanted Venom. I think a lot of that hurts this film, and sometimes I feel like Sam Raimi's sort of trolling, because like the whole dance sequence in particular where he's like pointing at people, that feels very much Sam Raimi. It feels like an sort of evolution from the raindrops are falling on my head thing from Spider-Man 2. Feels stylistically like part of what the Sam Raimi Spider-Man franchise is, but it feels like he took it way too far. I actually don't think a filmmaker as experienced as Sam Raimi was in 2007, and still is, would just lose the plot in the way he does. It almost really makes me feel he was sort of goofing because he knew this was a disaster. That makes more sense to me than thinking he tried to make a good movie, because like, let's be real, this is not good. I know people nowadays do this thing where they're like, but in a way all Spider-Man films are good. I'm like, in a way you have no opinion and you should be quiet. But I do think when I was watching, I was like, I think he's like making fun of us, like he's pushing this to like this ridiculous degree. Like, why have him in the black suit do all those sort of things? Like, and the black suit era is different from the things he was doing. Like, stylistically, in the kind of era of Spider-Man comics, didn't have the black suit. That's the 80s and 90s. It doesn't really work. Like, that shouldn't have happened in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. Maybe in Mark Webb's, God forbid, or, you know, in John Watts's or something, but it doesn't really work here. I mean, even like the way, like, they even have J. Jonah Jameson's astronaut son in these films, and they don't use the black suit reason it got back to Earth. Like, it's like they have it. They have the reason. Like, I don't know, a meteor lands in Central Park, which is really stupid. Like, didn't the cartoon in the 90s do that? Like, it's not cool. Like, I don't like that. And then the design is just the suit, but black. Like, you couldn't think of something else. Like, I really don't like any of that at all. It just very much doesn't fit. I think that's the problem with this, is like, stylistically, what Raimi brings to it and the influences he has do not mesh with a lot of what they're trying to do here. It just becomes a very messy, overstuffed narrative that doesn't really know what it wants. You know, I think my favorite black suit thing in media I've ever seen is the Spectacular Spider-Man version, which gave enough credit to the black suit part, because they're really two different stories. they're not the same story, like putting in one, I know they want to do Venom stuff, would represent a lot more to the audience, because this doesn't, I think, represent very much at all. But like Sony really pushing like, well, what matters for Spider-Man, but in a sense, like, I don't think Sam Raimi was doing all of Spider-Man, much like how Richard Donner was more considering, like, you know, that era of Superman, not like what the other Superman movies would try to do. Sam Raimi was specifically doing an era of Spider-Man, and I don't get that from the other director. I sort of, Mark Webb felt like he was doing the 90s. The MCU movies sort of just do all of it, but like this might be one of the few comic book movies that picks a particular era of a superhero and does that. And if you're going to do that, then don't put stuff in the 80s and 90s if it's not part of that era. Like, get a new director, or maybe like say, okay, you can finish up what you're doing, and then maybe when 4 will mix it around a little bit. And if they're not interested, move on and do Venom somewhere else. But I think it's like, as popular as this franchise was, I guess it made sense that you would do what was considered one of the biggest Spider-Man storylines of all time. But I just don't think, like, none of it really makes sense to it. And having the 3 villains at the same time and not giving it enough time to do it just adds to the extra element of like that this movie is a total fucking mess. In the ending, where like you have 3 villains having their own like kind of end scenes and stuff like that, and it feels like Sandman could come back. It is so weird that Thomas Hayden Church got this from like Sideways of all movies. I don't think that would even happen now. Sideways would be the movie it was, but I've always really liked him in it. But it does feel like even though they have the amazing subway fight and they do a lot of cool things with him becoming Sandman is an incredible scene. Like him of the sand forming and like trying to figure out his powers is probably might be one of the most powerful villain realizing their power scenes in these movies, although the Doc Ock stuff is pretty amazing too. It's also interesting, if you look at, you can tell who Raimi likes more, because of the 3 villains, he's the only one who gets this scene where you get a humanizing thing where you see him sort of understand his villain powers. You do not get that from the other ones, which I think is because he likes Sandman and not the other 2. But I really like Thomas Hayden Church's. He seemed to like get what this film is. Tobey Maguire is a little off and strange in this, is like his weirdest performance, but I like him. And I've heard people praise Kirsten Dunst in this. I quite liked her in this. She has a very good, her and Tobey Maguire have a really good human moment at the very end of this film where they just see each other at a restaurant and they just hug, and that moment sort of took me aback. We see this huge epic finale and like with too many endings and too many villains and all this stuff, and it's just like they don't make out, they're not like we're gonna have a baby and like all these things. It's just like, let's just hug, end of movie. I was a little taken aback by that. I thought that was actually a very sweet moment. It's a moment we don't ever talk about because there's nothing to really talk about there. Just 2 people going, hey, we love each other, but they've had a long relationship. They've obviously been going out and stuff like that for however long. And I just thought it was a nice, sweet sort of moment that Sam Raimi put in there at the end. It kind of makes it mean more, because you see some of these blockbusters, they have the big ending and they never have that moment. And I thought it was like a nice moment of sincerity in this like corporate sludge, which I quite liked. James Franco is sort of just always great as Harry Osborn. I know he is canceled and stuff, but he was good in the second one, but he's, I think, also good here. But Topher Grace is pretty horrible. Like, I don't know why he was trying to do the Anthony Michael Hall jock thing, and it's just like only Anthony Michael Hall can go from nerdy guy to jock thing, and not Topher Grace. I don't like Bryce Dallas Howard as Gwen Stacy. She looks like it, but I don't know why James Cromwell's here. All the usual cast characters are pretty good. I do like this was shot by Bill Pope, right off of Team America. Well, he'd done that a couple of times a little bit before this, but in this film, the certain action sequences, particularly with Gwen Stacy and the buildings falling apart and like the swooping camera thing that they're doing way more CG, a lot of that is really great, like really well-staged action sequences. It feels like Sam Raimi has upped his game yet again, and Bill Pope is amazing at using the camera in those scenes, and it's really sophisticated and interesting. I wish sometimes Spider-Man's choreography was better. He's just like doing this thing, and he does it a few times where he's just shooting tons of webs at people. He's just going, he does it like 3 or 4 times in it. Why is he doing that? Like that was awful. But other than that, like him, like where he's about to he loses the wedding ring and then he grabs it, and in the fight with Harry Osborn, You have in that sequence with the crane and the building is pretty incredible. Those things are great. You don't get that in the finale, unfortunately, but those sequences early on are very visually impressive. Very much push the boundaries of what you expect from a Spider-Man movie or a movie in general at the time. And I think, there's some of this stuff with the CG that doesn't age well, and there's certain special effects that don't. But those camera shots very much do, and Bill Pope is a DP I've liked for a long time. And even though I don't really like this movie, I think he did a good job shooting it. And I do sort of like the Tobey Maguire in the black suit dancing scene. I think it's funny. I don't care. It goes on too long. It gets in these weird directions with him as like the upside down kiss was so iconic, and like I thought that was like, I still think that's fucked up. I wouldn't be doing that, Spider-Man. I was like, that was a bridge too far. Even for any time I watch it, I'm like, I just don't. I remember people in the theater everyone audibly gasped, like, you can't be doing that. Mary Jane, come on, man. It really felt like everybody knew that was not cool. This movie's a mess. It's not good. There are some cool things about it, and I think that's probably why it's lived on. It's lived on more than X-Men The Last Stand from a year before, which was honestly probably just as, gotten as many screens. I knew just as many people saw it. I'm not sure what the grosses are off the top of my head, but there are a lot of big franchises from those, but we still talk about this. And I don't think it's just because it's a Spider-Man movie, because nobody talks about those awful Andrew Garfield movies. And he made one, they made one that was worse, Amazing Spider-Man 2. And although we make sort of jokes about Jamie Foxx in it, it doesn't get brought up as much as this. And I think it's because of the love of the previous two films, but I also think it's because this film does kind of push its boundaries a little more in ways that, like, it shouldn't. And I really do think Sam Raimi's sort of trolling in this. I really think he's sort of fucking with us because he knows this is a disaster and it's not going to work with what he's doing stylistically, which I think is what's so amazing about these. Like really, we don't get like, oh, I'm going to do Iron Man, but 80s Iron Man. I'm going to do Captain America, but 90s Captain America. This was like the only shot we got where it's like, well, let's do Spider-Man, but it's 60s Spider-Man. Like, it's very much that through and through, even though it's like early 2000s as fuck, really. It is like too much early 2000s. And it's also funny that the Spider-Man movie with the Dashboard Confessional song is not this one with Emo Spider-Man. I find that, I realized that. I was like, how did that work? I don't think you can save this movie. I maybe if you cut it up into 3, I know some of the people who worked on said it should have been 2 parts. I just don't think a lot of the plot lines in this should have been in it. And they should have understood what they were really making with it and what this franchise was and why people like it so much. And I know the black suit is a major Spider-Man thing, and I think they came to these conclusions, same with the Dark Phoenix and the X-Men movies. They're like, but we have to do this plot line, and they're not thinking about the franchise that they developed and what that type of franchise can do. And this is the Raimi Spider-Man trying to handle one of those and failing completely. It was, I guess, the clone saga of my 2000 Spider-Man, and it was probably just as disappointing, but you still at the end, I think, like Spider-Man, and you'll flip through those issues or hear these stories, just sort of get a glimpse of them. But ultimately, and you might remember certain things about it, and some, images float with you, but this is, and I don't think of a Sam Raimi movie that's, other than Oz the Great and Powerful, that is so horrible you can't take anything from it. And I think this is still from an era where he's visually impressive, interesting filmmaker who can still do some cool stuff with it. And Spider-Man 3 kind of highlights what really works about him, but I think it ends a kind of really golden period where he is a major studio director making major movies because the studio had to ruin, this awesome, really cool franchise. But really, I don't think anyone fully got what they were doing with this and understood the franchise they were doing it with. And then we ended up sort of just with this. So if you've seen Spider-Man 3 and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.